Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Brian Link, COO here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. On today's episode, I'm really excited to have Chris Rathermel as our guest. Chris is VP of IT at Spero Health, a Nashville-based outpatient drug and alcohol treatment provider with 95 clinics and over 35,000 patients served. My conversation with Chris is the first of a two-part conversation with folks from Spero. On our next episode, you will hear me talk to Chris DeGeorge on the operations side of the business. My goal for this series is to hear from both IT and the business on what IT does for Spero, how each side thinks about that role, what they do to gauge its effectiveness, and ultimately how both are working to make IT help Spero be successful. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chris Rathermel. Chris Rathermel, welcome to Cut the Shit. How you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here.
Well, I know you do this like 4 or 5 times a week, so hopefully this won't be too boring for you.
Very well.
Hey, listen, so before we get into the meat of the discussion, I always like to start with a sort of, I call it a warm-up, but I don't know what it is really, just something I'm always interested to hear the answers. What's the most interesting use of technology you've seen lately? Kind of, it could be at work, it could be at home, some sort of a hack that kind of grabbed your attention that you maybe seen in the last, could be recent, could be in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm fascinated maybe because I don't get to play in as much of the creative space anymore. But Midjourney, this AI generative art, right? Feed it a list of prompts, and it is able to really expand upon NLP technology as well as digital art, create amazing content. And then folks that are expanding that with things like ChatGPT combined with this to create things like a storyboard or a children's book, all through created by just being a director and
Yep.
kind of having a lot at your fingertips. So I think that's it's super fun to just run down that rabbit hole for sure.
Well, and it's interesting because, there's obviously strong opinions about AI all across the board. Those that are really positive, those that are the negative ones are probably louder than the positive ones in the most for the most part. But that's an interesting example of where, the AI itself is, it doesn't do it by itself, right? It needs, to your point, I think you used that expression correctly, thinking of it as playing the director role, right? And pulling those pieces together, still providing sort of the creative direction for what the output is, but the AI is actually doing it. So you can generate things really quickly, but you still have to have the idea. So it's kind of an interesting meld of sort of the human and the artificial, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, cool. Let's get into it. Before we get into the heart of the discussion, so to speak. Well, I know you well. For the purposes of this conversation, the audience, Spero is one of our customers, and I've had the good fortune to work fairly closely with Chris over the last few years. He's one of my favorites. It's part of why I asked him to be on the podcast. But I realized I only know a little bit about your sort of background story, so I'm going to learn something here too. So give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch on your sort of career, kind of how you got to Spero, and then we'll talk a little bit about the company.
Yeah, I think of myself as a untraditional person in this seat, but maybe that's a little bit of imposter syndrome coming out. So I'll give you some overview. So I started my career in help desk in college, working for Charter Communications, just trying to learn how to troubleshoot things very quickly. Then moved to a software engineering role for, like, I think the 13th largest tax and accounting firm in the US called Baker Tilly, and learned a lot through the recession of how to build products in a lean team with lean budgets. And that was very good teeth to cut. Played a role of analyst and developer and support all throughout that. And then moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and worked for a company called Kroll, doing a lot of software engineering. This is .NET, where I wasn't marrying as much of that analyst role anymore, more just trying to get good at software engineering. And then I got into the leadership aspect of things, leading software teams and leading companies. So started a healthcare IT company in town and really been in that startup and fast-paced growth ever since. And over the last few years, as you do in Nashville, Tennessee, if you don't have a banjo, you're probably at a healthcare company. So really started to gravitate towards that scene, and really enjoyed just all there is to learn about healthcare and tech and being connected to the patients. But I also recognized I wasn't as connected to the patient experience as I wanted to be. So that is great over here at Spero, where I'm actually much more connected to the patient journey and patient outcomes over here at Spero. And if you want me to, I can dive deeper into the.
Yeah, good. Just keep going. Yeah, tell us a little bit about Spero and sort of the origin story and kind of what the company's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we offer addiction treatment services, substance abuse treatment. That's a combination of medication that you can take to curb those cravings, as well as support in finding a job, finding housing, and counseling services, both one-on-one and group counseling. So they call that an integrated care model.
Is it all outpatient, or do you do some inpatient as well?
Good question. It's all outpatient, and that's where our focus is today. Many of our competitors are going to do a blend of both, but
right.
We're getting really good at outpatient and scaling that model. On the IT front, we've got different departments to support the organization across that. So we have a traditional help desk team that's helping with hardware and kind of Microsoft stack type things. And then you have a clinical IT support team supporting things like our EMR and more advanced things like Dragon, or our lab information system that tests our urine of our patients to make sure that they're taking their prescriptions that they're prescribed, as well as that they're not taking illicits that they're not supposed to be, and giving guidance throughout that process. Additionally, we have a small but mighty business intelligence group trying to make sense of all that data, both operationally, clinically, financially, all those fun things. Really small sysadmin group as well, really kind of elevated folk out of the help desk role into that role, which is maybe folks listening or having folks in those same kind of seats with lean teams these days.
Got it. So that feeds into so we got a little bit of background on Spero, and that kind of helps get the conversation going where I want to go. So as I mentioned, this is the first of a two-part conversation we're going to have here on the podcast with folks at Spero. Chris, he already knows this, right? He's actually introduced me to the business person who will be the second conversation that I'll have. It'll be the next episode after this one. But I wanted to talk to Chris to get his perspective on how does he see the role of IT within Spero, and how does he see that relating to kind of the business success of the company, and how do you operationalize that? How do you go about trying to make that happen? And then the second conversation will be kind of looking in the other direction, which is talking to someone on the business side, thinking about from an operational perspective, running an outpatient medical company. Where does technology fit into that, and how does he, and it's a he in this case, how does he think about how is technology helping him and the company be successful, and how does he see that, and see where this a Venn diagram, it should be pretty tightly overlapped, but I'm sure there'll be some gaps, if nothing else, because of when you sit in a different seat, oftentimes you see things differently. That's just the nature. That's not always even bad. Sometimes you need that. So with that, you talked a little bit about the areas. Give us a quick overview of the team itself. You mentioned a few different areas. What's the scope of the operation today from a technology standpoint?
Yeah, so pretty small team serving about 600 teammates across the organization. We have an IT team of about 8, a couple of people in that technical support role, a 3-person team doing the kind of clinical application support, 1-person FTE in business intelligence, 1 in security / sysadmin. So it's a pretty small team for sure, but covering those specific domains. And my background as a jack of all trades has definitely helped to blend that, but I've just got great unicorns in each one of those seats to allow me to stay that lead for right now as well.
Nice. And so as you think about, I know you haven't been there forever, but you've been there a decent amount of time. When you think about those responsibilities that you just described, have those responsibilities been fairly static, or have new things been added and other things taken away as the business has evolved?
Yeah. So it's definitely expanded a little bit. So when I started, we were at about 50 clinics, and we're at about 95 right now. So you can kind of imagine a half of a seat kind of getting added to each one of those groups over my tenure. And then really just what they're able to accomplish has expanded, mainly because when I started, we were fighting fires all the day. Maybe because that was new, maybe because that was just the breakneck growth, or all of the reasons. But we got to the point where now we're not fighting fires every day. We're solving new problems that we haven't solved before, and we're able to do that with a smaller team, with more just standardization of things. So that's been great. The business intelligence team went from a contractor role to more of an FTE role, which is great. The sysadmin role was really under my purview, and I graduated out of that, which was great. So yeah, that's really kind of how it's morphed over time.
And you mentioned firefighting versus, sort of now being, a little more standardized, got a little bit better processes in place. So being able to solve maybe other problems a little more proactively. How have you identified those problems? What's been the process by which you've found new problems to solve?
Yeah. I'd like to say that it was, through deep, data-driven analysis, but it starts with good conversation, both with my team and my department, and really open dialogue with the business. Take, for example, we had this group that we called de novo teams, and it's where we're opening up new clinics across the organization. And we say, hey, we met all of our deadlines. Everything's great. All of your stuff was, delivered to you on time. You had connectivity, and we cut the ribbon on the day we said we were going to. Let's stack hands, and we all did great. Well, we had high employee turnover in that particular group as an organization. And one of the things that they would say in their exit interview is like, I just didn't feel like there's just a lot of stuff from a technology perspective to work, and not all of it worked. And it was just a rocky start. And I said, whoa, okay, well, that's on me to fix. I'm glad that I know that now, and made a concerted effort to do a lot of auditing and deep diving and handoffs and verification throughout that experience. And I turned that around completely, which is great. But it starts with asking and finding out that information. One thing I'll plug is kind of a blameless problem solving culture within my department, where we can openly dialogue around, hey, this system went down. Why? Well, I didn't feel like I had great requirements at the outset, or I actually turned a thing and I didn't think it would break. This other thing, really opening up that dialogue has been paramount for us to do that root cause analysis and get better as a team.
Gotcha. Okay. And outside of the team, so looking at the business itself, what kinds of have they been part of that feedback process as well? And has that been comfortable in the sense of that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I think for the most satisfied customers are going to be happy sharing that information, and some of the ones that are maybe in the middle are maybe open to give a little constructive feedback. It was the folks that were kind of lurking in the shadows with like, hey, I'm going to leave this job because it's kind of terrible, and IT is a component of that, that was difficult to get that information even when asking. And I think the exit interview process, which was great to at least pull that out, even if it was kind of too late for that particular individual, it was great to fix it at scale. So, full disclosure, it's not a pretty picture sometimes, but it was good to get the problem solved eventually, and happy where we're at now.
Gotcha. All right. So that kind of leads, I think, to maybe thinking at sort of higher level, kind of thinking about technology within the broader scope at Spero. So how do you understand your team and your department's role within the broader business at Spero? I mean, and then how, as you think about that, how has that success been defined, right, by the team and quantified? And I say the team here, it could be below you, but probably more likely you and senior management, in the sense of how do you define success? If we're now really talking about is how do we know if we're winning, quote unquote, as it relates to providing internal services?
Yeah, so for us, we're in a growth stage for our company. I talked about we started at 50 clinics, now at 95. We're still about growing our patient census, both in retention and in growth. And everybody's a part of that number. It's not just marketing, it's not just clinical and operations, it's also IT. So it's nice to not have a bunch of other vanity metrics to hide behind. We succeed and fail as a company, so you can't really count yourself out of that particular goal as an IT department. And I own that. So things like adding retention campaign outreach for SMS and email messages for folks that went to their first appointment but haven't come back are things that I created, not because someone told me to, but because I know what the goal is as the company, and that's where I'm going to put my effort towards to try to, it takes a village in a lot of ways to make it happen. And you shouldn't wait for some other, growth department, business leader, executive to assign you a project. You should really come to the table with ideas on what you think you can do creatively within your budget, your time to see if it can move the needle.
So that's interesting, because that's basically, you're talking about new, really I'll call it new service development or new service components, right, to deliver value to the end customer. So it feels to me, if I think about your department, right, you got a combination of ways to help the company, grow, right, and that's obviously new components like you just described, but also helping existing providers on the business be successful, do what they need to do, right? And that could be it could be the basics, like making sure you got internet connectivity, to, support, making sure that if folks are struggling with application access or whatever it might be, that they get back on track so they can focus on serving patients, because that leads to retention and growth. How difficult has it been to put together a package of metrics or a set of metrics that, they're like anything, you want those to be comprehensive enough that they're helpful, but not so much that, it's just too much, like you can get buried. How have you guys attacked that problem in conjunction with the business, I guess is a question I'm asking.
Yeah, so I create an annual plan. Each one of those subgroups gets about 3 KPIs. We look at those quarterly to see where they're trending, and we see which ones aren't that helpful after, trying to pull them together. So take critical uptime and downtime numbers for the sysadmin role, and security, SOC, responsiveness. Like, some of that is just bread and butter.
Yeah.
But I think the alignment for us is really on the projects and the timelines that we can execute on those. So, hey, when can we get a new version of this particular product? Hey, when can we get that? Your other KPIs and a lot of things are just, hey, did you keep the lights on 99.9% of the time, and how much did it cost for you to do that? And the value that I see is really in that project development, that project phase where you're switching vendors, where you're upgrading things, where you're adding new services. And it's definitely hard, because it feels like you have one job, which is to keep the lights on, and maybe people care about that particular aspect of your job less.
Yeah, they don't care, right? I mean, they care if it doesn't work, right? It's like being an offensive lineman, right? They only care if you don't make your block, right, at the end of the day. So
yeah, I'll throw one thing out there that I tried to maybe add some meaning to. So it was like, help desk response time. Not all tickets are created equal. We created a way to have an urgent ticket requested. Sure, that's abused at some cases.
Right.
But to have that lane available really improved our customer satisfaction. And it's worth the noise that we have to deal with, even when they shouldn't really be in that lane, and we kind of coach appropriately.
Yeah.
And now I don't have to get every ticket down. I don't need to keep the total queue number down. I'm working on SLAs instead. So that was a thing that really, again, it was more of a KPI that I care about, to have the end effect of improving customer satisfaction.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, living in the world where we do, we thread the needle like you, right? There's a keep the lights on aspect to what we do, right? Where some people we're helping some people with services that they don't want to do internally, either for could be positive reasons like we're better at it than they are, or I'll use negative. I don't mean negative reasons, but they need, 5 people and we're the equivalent of the cost of 4.5. So it's really a cost play in that sense. Right. And so, that's somewhat commoditized services, right? Keeping the lights on. You do the best you can. And there are ways, I think, as you just described, to do everything better, no matter what it is, even keeping the lights on. But I agree with you that it's those projects that create the opportunity for the business to do something they couldn't do before or do something differently is where, that's where you have the chance to shine, right? I mean, that's how you get somebody's attention on the business side of the house for sure. To that point, do you feel like your business partners understand your definition of success as it relates to technology?
Great question. I think when it comes to, as long as I can put it in terms of what it means to them. So I want to make sure that your teammates on your team don't leave because of IT issues. That's a great way to put it then. Hey, I'm going to have an SLA response time of this, and if it's in this category, it's going to be answered. That doesn't translate as well. You've really got to connect the dots. You have to sell it to them on what are they actually buying, what are the benefits of the thing that you're going to try to provide. And I do take a minute to try to translate, even if I give the more technical explanation first. Really kind of end and land with that so that they know the why. Yeah.
And so you basically just talking about telling a story right there, and in a good way. Mechanically speaking, how do you do that? How often do you talk to these people? I'm sure a lot of it is informal. What are the mechanisms you're using to tell that story? Because any good story needs to be told over and over and over again, right? Once you feel like you've told it so many times, you don't want to tell it again, you're probably just finally getting people to hear it. So that's usually the way it works. I figure it's no different in your organization as it is anywhere else. So,
yeah, I think for having an organization where I don't see a lot of the teammates that I support on a regular basis, it's to the point where every opportunity, taking the time to really kind of set your brand and your mission and what you're about at every encounter is a great thing to do. We do leadership summits about every 8 weeks as a company. And we try to avoid less cross-departmental meetings or just top-down kind of things. And that's a great way for us to sync. I give the good, bad, and ugly about my department. The other departments do the same. We ask questions. It's a great little chance for us to understand what we're working on and why. There's a lot that happens there. And then we also go to dinner and some activities like curling or Top Golf, right. And the real conversations start to come out organically as well, which is great.
Can I ask, how big is that group?
So it flexes between 20 and 50. We kind of carve out one section where it's 20, 22 for call it director and above, and then we also include area managers. So if you manage 95 clinics, you're going to have a facility administrator over each one of those, and eventually when your region gets bigger, you're going to have area managers and then a regional manager on top of that.
Okay. Just was curious how you manage, because that's just functionally speaking, we're thinking about that too, about how do we make sure that when we have time together, we get the most out of it, right? Because we're not fully remote, but we're hybrid, and so to your point, a lot of people, can go long periods of time without actually seeing each other face to face. It's just the nature of it these days. So, okay, so that helps kind of think about how you're approaching the business, so sort of the groups you're supporting. On the flip side, how are you helping the team sort of understand and appreciate that definition? You talked some about your KPIs, but what are you doing to communicate and to connect your story for them so that they really get it and are really thinking the same way?
So we take a moment to do something called IT insights, and we have control of the distribution lists and the rights to be able to send those. So why not create our own marketing department, right, within IT? And we're blessed with an individual that is very good at that, has an eye for it, that works on our support team as well. And we take the time to do a tips and tricks kind of IT newsletter, and we'll pepper in some branding and some mission and some things that we're working on into that as well. And the other thing is to not hide behind the support desk at each encounter. We have 95 clinics, we'll call it about 90 or so facility administrators. When they have a question for us, we're going to try to not just always reply to that email so that it's faster, but to call them and better understand where they're coming from, if they have any other issues, if it's truly been solved versus just closing the ticket, and really connecting with that group. I'll tell you, for the folks listening, we're almost needing to do like IT team lunches with the amount of cookies that they send to us as an organization for how much appreciation that we have on a regular basis. And this is out of their own pocket, right? Sending it to our department. Talk about KPIs. It's a cookie KPI.
That's solid. That's solid. Yeah. And that's, I mean, like you said, it may not be a real KPI, but it shows a lot, right? And as the head of that group, that's a good thing to see for sure. So where, we've talked some about the good stuff. Where do you feel like you're struggling when it comes to delivering against expectations?
I think the balance that I continue to need to remind myself of is to not fill my schedule and fill my plate with all of the things that I want to get done, and to make room for those ad hoc questions, for that initiative that nobody's asked you for support for. But if you just invite yourself to that meeting, you're going to see that you can add value to that initiative that's critical to the business. And within that, it's not about looking busy or checking everything off the box in the timeline that you thought it was. Really just connecting with what the business needs. And to do that, you really have to both carve out capacity and really get invited and invite yourself into those areas where your organization is struggling. And if your CEO, your executive leadership is forthright enough to tell you, you know what those areas are. Just go ahead and be part of the solution versus waiting for operations or somebody else to go fix that problem. Go ahead, value.
And if you're not embedded, right, you don't really have a choice. The only way to kind of get into the conversation is to get into the conversation, right? At least insert yourself in some way. I would imagine it's probably a combination. Sometimes you get invited, other times you just need to. They wouldn't have thought about it, but then they're like, "Oh, glad Chris is here," right? That kind of thing. So sort of on the flip side of that, where do you feel like you're really shining? Where do you feel like, as you think about the IT group today, where do you feel really good about what you guys are doing as it relates to the business?
Yeah, support is really strong, which is great. And then an area that we've really expanded on is that clinical applications role. So we've hired a leader of that team, and they're adding value across the organization. I'm talking about with how fast and how seamless we can go through the revenue operations team, that we can partner with clinical changes, that we can partner with the business intelligence group to refine forms to get the right data at the right. So they're liaisoning between so many different operational groups, and they're pulled in so many different directions, call them Gumby half the time, but truly adding a ton of value across the organization, which is great. And that's not really an arm of the organization that existed before. So I'm really happy to see that. Other areas, business intelligence, our team is at that small stage of just one FTE. And we actually partner with my VP of finance. We're kind of co-owning that from an executive perspective. He has a subject matter expertise that's great. I have great technical, and we've got one FTE between the two of us to kind of fight between times and initiatives and things like that. And it's great to lay foundation and, not blow the budget. It's also just so much to do and so little time kind of thing, where I'm sure you've seen organizations and departments where it's just right on that edge where they kind of don't have enough to support growing it to where it needs to be. But really happy with the output given the investment, but it's just at that tough spot.
Yeah. And that's one that it creates. I mean, if you're doing it right, like the demand is pretty much insatiable. You can't ever really do enough because there's always more questions to ask about whatever. If you're generating data analytics and reports, well, then all that does, it's like sending email, right? If you send an email, you're generally going to get a couple back. If you generate a data analytics report, well, you're going to get requests back for more, right? It's just an onion that you never really can completely unpeel. So yeah, I can totally get that. As you think about, so you've got a fairly small team, but sounds like you used, I believe, small but mighty, and I like that description. I think everybody's sort of striving for that, even big and mighty, but certainly small but mighty is more impressive. Is there anything about Spero in particular, or your team story that make it challenging for you to find the right people to join the team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think certainly folks that are capable of really good critical thinking and don't require a lot of middle management oversight. So full disclosure, many of the teammates that work for Spero don't even know who I am. And that's intentional. One, to maybe avoid my inbox filling up, but also to let my team shine. And you don't need an executive in the room to make every decision and solve every problem. That has been great, while also still magically maybe having enough cross-functional knowledge between those groups. Certainly there's some single points of failure from the human capital side, but to not be the only person that knows how to do that thing where that team can go on vacation and be out and the world doesn't stop, which is great. We got lucky with a few key hires in both their background. One of my sysadmin, for example, started as a counselor, started providing care for our patients as a counselor, moved into a help desk IT role, and is now sysadmin. That particular individual knows our company better than most.
Sure, done the front line, done the actual patient care work, right? Which is hard to find in an IT organization in healthcare for sure.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, kind of wrap up with a couple last questions. As you think about sort of where you guys are, sort of how you're situated today and the relationship you have with your business partners, if you could get them, the business partners, to better understand something about IT or maybe specifically about your operation, what would that be?
I think security is also is something that is difficult to engage the average business leader or teammate on understanding the complexity, understanding it from an investment, a budget, their role, how complex it is, given kind of changing landscape. That's certainly something that is difficult to convey quickly, right? And trying not to have folks glaze over when you start talking about the security incidents that you manage. So that's definitely one topic. Other areas is just the prioritization of different projects. I think about building trust with your department, especially if you're new to a role or you're really trying to build trust as a department. I think a lot of it is doing what you said you were going to do, and to do that, it feels like you're stuck on rails and you can't miss deadlines or you can't reprioritize. You also just have to also recommunicate and recommunicate the why. And if other folks need to be a part of that decision, helping them make the decision with you so that it doesn't seem like it was done to them, it was done with them. So that's definitely a balance I can continue to get better at, but that's what I try to keep in mind.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, as you look ahead and you think about sort of the trajectory of how things are going, what excites you most about the next 2 to 3 years? I mean, you and I have talked a little bit, so I know some about the stuff going on with virtual and some of that stuff, but that's maybe more in the weeds. I just maybe more at a more macro level. What gets you excited when you think ahead? And I'll use 2 to 3 years as a time. We don't have to get too much longer than that.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that technology will, in healthcare, will kind of break out of this this stagnation, this always behind. I think to talk about COVID yet again, I think was a great thing to happen to this industry to where the Band-Aid got ripped off. We're doing a lot more things with technology that would have taken much longer to do. And I'm hoping that we'll continue to kind of snowball that effect. When you add that with things like AI, I think it's a great time to be in healthcare IT, where we're not only catching up, but we're maybe getting to the point where we're on par with other industries, which is great. And that's really exciting, because I think if there was a downside to being in healthcare IT personally, is that it never felt like, unless you were doing a healthcare SaaS startup, that you were on the cutting edge and using all of the latest, greatest things. You were always held back from an integration or legacy systems or
Right.
regulations and all those things. So I'm hopeful that those barriers will start to get knocked down over the next couple of years.
So last question, and it's kind of a downer question, not necessarily, but we'll end with something more positive. So don't worry. But the flip side of that, what concerns you or what scares you as you think about that same time horizon?
Yeah, I think security is certainly something that is difficult, and I'll add a little bit more color to that. So I think the organizations, with how lean most of us are, and the money getting thrown at our adversaries, creating very efficient teams at gaining access to your data and your systems and crippling them for the purposes of financial gain or doing harm, is imbalanced. I joined a group that's a task force with the government and private agencies called the 405D, and trying to be in those conversations where we're creating resources for our country to be better defended against really an outmatched, outgunned kind of scenario. And I think if there are things that hold us back as a country and as an industry, it is security, where patients' lives are at risk if you get ransomware and you can't offer the services that your patients rely on. That's critical to life-saving care.
Yeah, there's a collective action problem baked in there for sure. When you split the resources across, hundreds of thousands of companies, right? Whereas everybody's got kind of the same challenge, right? It's a different flavor of the same ice cream. But yeah, and I mean, if you're not scared about technology, about security, then you're not paying attention.
Right.
I mean, it is what it is. And it's, we live on the same, in many ways, a different version of that same story. Right. And we talk about it all the time about, how much insurance can you buy, right, to protect yourself in the event of something bad happening. And it's not easy, because existential risks are real. And the cybersecurity insurance business really is very immature. It's not there yet, right? And it's not, and they've gotten crushed over the past 3 years anyway. So, they've what went from being, a high margin product in 2012 or 2013, where people wrote a check for $1,000 and they never had a claim, to the inverse of that the past 2 or 3 years. Whereas, so that I see that whole business probably looking at a transformation, and maybe not a good one in terms of helping us with what we're talking about.
I would agree. I think of them more like a home warranty system that you were told was a good idea, but when you go to try to get the support you need, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true, especially given the amount of sort of care and feeding they're going to be expecting going forward. Things that are oftentimes difficult to do completely, but if they want to try to figure out a way to not pay, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I just mean they are in a situation, they're in a very bad situation as it relates to dealing with claims, for sure. So,
to give them some credit, it is helpful to see some of them trying to protect their assets that they're liable for, doing proactive scans against their customer networks and informing them of vulnerabilities and gaps, which I think is a great add.
I agree, and I think baseline standards that they require, I mean, it may feel onerous to some people, but the bottom line is, stuff that seems obvious, like, hey, you can't get cybersecurity insurance if you don't have multi-factor authentication, embedded in your organization. Well, that's just a good business practice. Like you should be doing that whether you need cybersecurity insurance or not. So they're doing you a favor, even though it costs money. Like that's money you should be spending, because the worst part, the inverse of that is bad news.
Exactly.
Sure. All right. Well, I always like to wrap up with something personal, not that personal, but you'll see what I mean when I ask. So I like to ask, my guests to share something you've watched or read lately that you think others ought to check out.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of two other podcasts that I'll throw out there. I listen to the All In podcast, which is pretty good for me to be more aware of venture capitalists and smart economic folks, to see how they see about the world. And then a more long form, more historic look at companies and technology, which is Acquired. They do a great job of just dissecting in really long form the story of a company that gives it enough time to understand the nuance of the rise and or fall of different leaders and companies. And I try to learn from other people's mistakes and go along the way. So that's been really helpful, really, for personal growth. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, Chris, that's all we've got time for today. I'll let you get back to getting to it for Spero. Thanks again for the time. Thanks for connecting me with one of your colleagues on the business side. I'm looking forward to talking to another Chris in a couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that, podcast listeners. And with that, Chris, thanks again for being on Cut the Shit. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on TikTok at @CutTheShitPod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel at Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.